Hey guys, it's Ranger Jake Bowling here at Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park for another installment of our virtual museum tour. I want to thank you guys again for joining us. So as per usual, I am standing in our awesome museum. Except for this time, we're not going to be highlighting any artifacts per se. We're going to be talking about another element of the museum, and that is some of the reader boards and panels that we have all the way throughout here. A little bit about the layout of our museum. If you've been here, you know that in the beginning, in the front, there's a huge timeline, and it starts sometime in the 1850s to show some of the key events that led up to the Civil War. And the timeline then takes you through the key events of the Civil War up to the Atlanta campaign, which is where our museum begins. Then as you walk through the museum, you'll see periodically it takes you through the months of the Atlanta campaign. And then at the very end, where I'm standing now, it takes you into the aftermath and the fallout of what happened after the Civil War and some of the other key events there. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is some of the events that happened at the tail end, that started at the back end of the Civil War and carried on and actually affects us to this day. And that is Reconstruction. The panel that I'm standing in front of, or that's to the right of me here, is Reconciliation and Reconstruction, and that's what we're going to talk about today in our program. Now, to start, Reconstruction officially, historians have it going from 1863 to 1877. The reason it starts before the war ends is because officially Lincoln began making official plans on what to do when the war was over as early as 1863. His idea, he knew that the reconciliation process was not going to be easy no matter when the war ended, and he wanted to get a jump on it. Unfortunately, in 1865, Lincoln's assassinated in April and does not see his plans come to fruition. Now, Lincoln's assassination, coupled with some of the plans that he had come up with in '63, coupled with just the overall tension that still existed, would really shape the next couple of years in this country's history and have ramifications many, many years down the road. So first of all, we'll go back and look at Lincoln's assassination. As you can imagine, people were already, with the surrender at Appomattox by Robert E. Lee and then Joseph Johnston in North Carolina, the war was coming to an end. The Confederacy had no ability to continue to fight, and people as a whole were ready for this thing to be over. Lincoln's assassinated less than 2 weeks after the surrender at Appomattox, and it stirs everything up again. People are mad. They are angry, and even though John Wilkes Booth acted alone, it is seen as an act of aggression by a poor loser, aka the South, or the former Confederacy. And that would shape some of the politics that we go into the years after the war. So we think about the South now, post-war South. It is broke, it is destitute, and with the new civil rights amendments that are coming in, the Emancipation Proclamation is now being, the states have to ratify that and respect it. There are amendments that allow for the voting for allow African Americans to vote, and whereas previously slaves were not seen as citizens of the United States, with some of the other amendments that came out, they are now. So the South is broke, and they're having to grapple with how to reintegrate into their setup. The slave trade and the institution of slavery was so embedded in their economy and their daily life, not to mention the persecution and racial discrimination that came with that system. So the South is trying to figure this out. And to make matters more difficult for them, the United States military has set up occupation in many of the southern states and has really pushing for these civil rights legislations. And what you get is you get the anger because of what happened to Lincoln, you get the anger for what happened during the war, and then you get pushback from the southern states. So essentially that time period from 65 to 77 was a series of military occupations, a series of back and forth in Congress trying to enact these legislations, a series of African Americans trying to integrate back into society in the southern states. And on top of that, pushback. You get pushback from the South. You get the development of the KKK, okay, the Ku Klux Klan, that started out as a Southern veterans organization and ended up being a tool of political persecution and fear, okay, to stop some of these civil rights legislations. Now, as time goes on, we get up to 1877, and what we have is part of that pushback in the South manifested itself in what started out being called black codes. So the South, in order to regain statehood, many of these states had to abide by these new amendments that provided civil rights, new civil rights laws to former slaves and African Americans in those areas. And some of these pushbacks came in the form of what I just mentioned, black codes. And this black codes were things that dictated, even though by law African Americans had to vote, or were allowed to vote now. So an example of one of the black codes, they would institute literacy tests or a payment. And seeing as many former slaves were forbidden to learn how to read, you can imagine that a literacy test would be very difficult to pass. Payments. Many freed slaves or former slaves did not have any employment. Okay, so they were not able to make money. There was other codes that said that all unemployed African Americans would be not rounded up necessarily, but kind of grabbed by the state and used, put into subservient positions. So put back onto farms as sharecroppers and things like that, which of course is just almost another version of slavery, legal slavery. So these things are happening between 65 and 77. And then what happens in 1877 is what we kind of see the end of Reconstruction. We see the unoccupation. We see the military officially leave and allow the states to kind of govern their affairs as they see fit. And what happens is a lot of the gains, which there weren't many because of all the pushback and kind of pressure from the president at the time, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat, a lot of pushback came in 77, and the states were basically trying to, any of the gains that were made by the civil rights legislations at the time were kind of erased, and the black codes became more formalized, and we get the beginning of what we would later know as the Jim Crow era. Now this is 1877, 1878, and you may be asking, well, why are we talking about that? That's way after the Civil War. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Well, as I just mentioned, you can see the clear path of how we got there. And the interesting thing about Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era is that is one extremely clear link to the past. Even though no one here, no one alive today was around in the 1800s, right? We still see that clear link to the past because that Jim Crow era and some of those Jim Crow laws would stick with us as a country, a lot of it in the South, until 1964. Not 1864, 1964, almost 100 years after the Civil War, okay, with the Civil Rights Act. That's how long these things would stick around. Now, when I mentioned the year 1964, a lot of us can now internalize that. We probably know people that were alive in 1964. And the distance between then and now, we still see that race relations and issues that stemmed from that era and that time period in the South still affect us to this day in a lot of different ways. So that about wraps up. Again, like a lot of the subjects we talk about in our museum tours and things like that, there is always so much more. People do get their PhDs in Reconstruction, but we just don't have all the time, unfortunately. So I hope that this was informative for you. If you would like more information on this time period in history, we have several books here at the Visitor Center, or any one of the rangers would be happy to kind of talk to you and field any questions you have. So with that being said, again, I want to say thank you very much for attending this virtual museum tour on Reconstruction, and we hope you have a wonderful day.